A black doctor boards first class. Flight attendant tries to remove him. Then learns who he really is. A well-dressed black man boards his first-class seat, looking forward to a quiet flight home. But moments later, a flight attendant walks up to him. Her expression unreadable, her voice laced with suspicion. "Sir, I need to see your boarding pass again." He complies, handing it over without a word. She scans it, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You must have made a mistake. Are you sure you're supposed to be in first class?" The passengers around them start to glance over, sensing the tension. "Yes," he responds, his tone calm but firm. "I'm in the right seat." But she doesn't back down. What happens next sets off a chain of events no one saw coming. One that will leave the entire cabin in stunned silence and cost someone their job before the flight even takes off. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story powerful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. It was just an ordinary flight, until it wasn't. The airport was a place of motion. A constant, unrelenting stream of arrivals and departures. It was a place where people came and went. Where faces blurred into one another. Where the past and the future intersected in the sterile hum of an intercom and the impatient shuffle of feet. But even in this sea of movement, some people stood out, and not always for the reasons they should. Elise Gardner had never been one to shrink herself. She moved through the terminal with the quiet confidence of a woman who had long since learned that she had every right to be where she was. The tailored lines of her navy blue suit framed her like armor. Her black leather briefcase held firm in her grip. She walked with the ease of someone accustomed to first-class lounges, high-rise boardrooms, and the kind of meetings where decisions were made before anyone even sat down. Yet, none of that mattered now. Because as she stepped onto Flight 227, she saw it, the moment of hesitation, the brief pause in the flight attendant's step, the flicker of something behind her carefully controlled expression. It was the smallest of things, barely perceptible to the untrained eye. But Elise had spent her life learning to see the shifts in the air. The changes in the way space was occupied. The flight attendant, Lorraine Tanner, was a woman accustomed to order. She took pride in the precision of her work, in the neat arrangement of first-class seats, in the quiet authority she wielded over the cabin. She had seen her fair share of passengers try to take what wasn't theirs. Try to slip into a seat they hadn't paid for. Act as though they belonged when they didn't. So, when she saw Elise settle into seat 2A, something in her resisted. It wasn't a thought. Not exactly. More of a feeling. A deep-seated suspicion that rose before logic could intervene. She told herself it wasn't about race. It never was. She was just doing her job. Ensuring everything was as it should be. "Excuse me, ma'am," Lorraine said, stepping forward with the kind of politeness that carried a subtle edge. "I just need to confirm your seat assignment." Elise didn't even blink. She reached into her bag, pulled out her boarding pass, and handed it over without a word. Lorraine glanced at it. Seat 2A, first class, paid in full, no errors. Still, she hesitated. There was something about the way Elise held herself. Something about the way she didn't explain, didn't defend herself. It unsettled Lorraine in a way she couldn't quite name. "Are you sure this is your assigned seat?" she asked again. Her voice light, her grip tightening on the small slip of paper. Elise tilted her head ever so slightly. A subtle shift, but a shift nonetheless. There was no anger in her expression, no frustration, just an understanding that ran deeper than words. "Yes," she said simply. It wasn't just a response. It was a statement of fact. A reminder, a quiet defiance wrapped in elegance. Lorraine felt something cold settle in her stomach. There were rules, procedures, and then there was this thing between them that had no official name, no category, but hung in the air all the same. It was a battle that had been fought in 1,000 places before this one. A battle that neither of them had chosen, but now found themselves locked in. A murmur from a few rows back. A man in seat 3C shifted slightly. His interest peaked. A woman in seat 1B exchanged a glance with her husband. The moment had stretched too long. People were noticing. Lorraine should have let it go. Instead, She straightened, clearing her throat. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside while we sort this out. Elise didn't move. There was no raised voice. No argument. Just stillness. And sometimes, stillness was the loudest response of all. I'm not moving, Elise said, her voice calm, measured. Something tightened in Lorraine's chest. A part of her knew she was about to make a mistake. A part of her wanted to stop, to step back, to let it go, but she had never been one to back down. So, she turned on her heel, walked toward the front of the cabin, and picked up the intercom phone. And with that, the choice was made. Lorraine Tanner gripped the intercom phone tighter than she needed to, her knuckles turning a shade paler as she pressed the button. Her voice, though calm, carried a weight that settled uneasily in the air. Ground control, we have a potential seating issue in first class. Please advise. The words sat there, cold and clinical, masking the unspoken. It wasn't an emergency, not in the way emergencies were usually defined. No threats, no violations, just a question hanging in the air like smoke. Was Elise Gardner supposed to be here? The moment Lorraine set the phone down, she felt it, a shift in the cabin. Small but unmistakable. The silence had changed. Before, it had been the quiet murmur of passengers settling in, the rustle of magazines, the muted hum of an overhead announcement. Now, it was something else. The silence of speculation, of assumptions taking root. A few rows back, a businessman in a navy blazer, his tie slightly loosened from the rush of airport security, leaned just a little to the side, as if to catch a glimpse of the woman in seat 2A. A couple in their late 50s, seated in the row ahead, exchanged a glance. Something small, something subtle, but telling. Elise noticed. Of course, she did. She had lived through this kind of silence before. It was the same silence that had followed her in board meetings when she walked in before the men in suits had realized who she was. The same silence that had met her at charity galas when introductions came too late. And eyes had already made their calculations. The same silence that had lived in the pauses of polite conversation. In the measured hesitations of those who weren't sure if they should be impressed or suspicious. She was used to it. But that didn't make it right. Lorraine moved briskly toward the galley, her mind churning faster than her steps. Something didn't sit right. Not about the ticket. That had been clear. Not about Elise. She hadn't done anything wrong. No. What unsettled Lorraine most was herself. The way her own breath had quickened when Elise refused to move. The way her hands had trembled just slightly when she reached for the intercom. The way she had called for backup not because there was a problem, but because she needed someone to confirm she wasn't the one making a mistake. Because what if she was? Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice at her side. Emily, the younger flight attendant, had approached quietly, careful not to stir the already thick air. Lorraine, she said, her voice low, hesitant. Are we sure about this? Lorraine turned to face her, her expression unreadable. It's just a routine check. Emily glanced back toward seat 2A. Then back at Lorraine. It doesn't feel routine. Lorraine stiffened. You weren't here last week when a man tried to slip into first class without paying. Her voice carried the sharp edge of justification. We can't afford to be careless. Emily hesitated. Then, softer. But that's not what this is. Lorraine opened her mouth, ready to push back, ready to defend the decision she had already set in motion. But she caught herself. The doubt was already spreading, like a crack in the foundation. She turned away before Emily could say anything else. Back in seat 2A, Elise let out a slow breath, folding her hands neatly over her briefcase. She had already seen the security officers step onto the plane. Two men, uniforms pressed, expressions neutral. She had known they were coming the moment Lorraine had walked away. Of course, they were. One of the officers, a tall man with close-cropped hair and the kind of face that had been trained into unreadability, approached her row. Ma'am, he said, his voice polite but firm. Would you mind stepping off the plane with us for just a moment? There's been a seating concern, and we'd like to clear it up. A seating concern. That was what they were calling it. Elise had spent years in rooms where power was decided, where fortunes were shifted with the stroke of a pen. She had seen contracts torn apart, Multi-million-dollar deals unraveled because someone had felt uneasy about the people on the other side of the table. She had learned, long ago, what power looked like, and more importantly, she had learned what it looked like when people mistook it for something else. She could have argued, could have pulled rank, could have let her name ring through the cabin like a gavel striking wood. Could have made a scene and forced them to see her the way they should have seen her all along. But that wasn't the game. Not here, not now. She stood. The officer stepped aside, letting her move past him. His posture carefully neutral. As she walked down the narrow aisle, she felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her. The man in seat 3C straightened his tie. The woman in seat 1B shifted in her seat. And Lorraine, standing near the cockpit, didn't meet her gaze. The security office just off the jet bridge was small, sterile, no windows, no distractions, just a desk, 2 chairs, and a clock that ticked too loudly in the silence. Elise sat, her briefcase resting neatly at her feet, her back straight. The officers checked her ID, her ticket, and ran whatever verification process they needed to satisfy themselves. And, as expected, they found nothing. She was exactly who she said she was. She had been all along. The taller officer cleared his throat, glancing at his partner before looking back at her. "Everything checks out," he said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been relief if he had allowed himself the luxury of emotion. "Apologies for the inconvenience, Ms. Gardner. You're free to reboard." Elise nodded, reaching for her briefcase. And then, just as she stood, she paused. A lifetime of restraint, of careful calculation, of knowing when to speak and when to let silence do the talking, almost kept her from saying the words already forming in her mind. But not today. Not this time. She turned, leveled the officer with a look so steady it forced him to hold her gaze. "Tell me," she said, her voice even, controlled, "what exactly made this necessary?" The question settled in the air between them, heavy and immovable. The officer hesitated, and in that hesitation, she had her answer. She gave a small, knowing smile, not one of amusement, but of understanding. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, her heels clicking against the tile. She had a flight to catch. And Lorraine Tanner had a decision to make. Lorraine Tanner stood frozen near the cockpit door. Her fingers curled so tightly around the edge of the service counter that her knuckles had turned a pale shade of white. The sound of Elise Gardner's heels striking the polished floor of the jet bridge echoed in her ears long after the woman had disappeared back into the terminal. She had watched her go. She had let her go. But it hadn't ended the way Lorraine thought it would. Elise hadn't stormed off. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't demanded anything. Not an apology. Not an explanation. She had walked away calmly, deliberately, leaving Lorraine with a question she could not shake. What exactly made this necessary? The words clung to her, weighed her down, pulled at something deep in her chest. Because she didn't know the answer. Or rather, she knew, but she couldn't bring herself to name it. A seating concern, that's what she had told security. That's what she had told herself. But it wasn't true, not really. She had looked at Elise Gardner. Her polished black briefcase, her crisp tailored suit, her unwavering confidence, and something inside her had clenched with unease. She had felt a ripple of doubt so instinctual, so automatic, that she hadn't stopped to ask herself why. And now, Elise is gone. The passengers had fallen into a hushed quiet. They didn't know what had happened. Not exactly, but they had seen enough. They had seen who had been asked to leave. The businessman in seat 3C stole another glance toward the empty seat 2A. His lips pursed in thought. The older couple in row 1 sat stiffly, their eyes flicking toward Lorraine when she passed, their silence saying what their words did not. They were watching her now. They had been watching all along. And she felt it, felt the shift in power. Subtle but undeniable. It wasn't just Elise who had been tested. It was her. And she wasn't sure she had passed. Elise Gardner stood just beyond the terminal gates, her fingers moving swiftly over the screen of her phone. Her boarding pass was still open, the flight number glowing back at her. Flight 227, delayed, awaiting passenger reboarding. Her name was still attached to it. she was still allowed back on. She wasn't surprised. Security had cleared her, because, of course, they had. The flight crew had confirmed her ticket. Because, of course, they did. She had always belonged in that seat. That had never been the issue. But belonging wasn't always enough. Not in this world. She exhaled slowly, closing her eyes for just a moment. Then, she turned, walked back toward the gate. This was still her flight. And she wasn't done yet. Lorraine had barely stepped into the galley before Emily appeared at her side. Her voice low, urgent. "She's coming back," Emily murmured. Lorraine felt her stomach tighten. "Are you sure?" Emily nodded, shifting slightly so Lorraine could see past her. Through the small galley curtain, the terminal came into view. And there, walking back toward the plane, was Elise. Lorraine felt something inside her go rigid. She had expected security to clear Elise, of course. There had been no real reason to remove her in the first place. But she had not expected her to come back. She had expected anger, resistance. Not this. Not this unshakable calm. Her mind reeled, searching for what to do next. She needed control, needed to reclaim the authority that had already begun to slip from her grasp. But how? "Lorraine." Emily's voice was quiet but firm. "Just let her sit down." Lorraine stiffened. She's done nothing wrong." Emily pressed. "You know that." Lorraine swallowed hard. Of course, she knew. But that didn't stop the heat from rising in her chest. The feeling of losing her grip. Passengers were already unsettled. If Elise sat down again. If she resumed her place. Unchanged. Unshaken. Then what did that say? That Lorraine had been wrong? That this had never been about safety? That it had been about something else entirely? She turned sharply, shoulders squared, her voice clipped. "I don't need you questioning me, Emily." Emily held her gaze for a moment longer. Then nodded once. "Understood." Lorraine turned back toward the cabin. Just in time to see Elise stepping onto the plane. The hush that settled over first class was immediate. No one spoke. No one needed to. Passengers shifted in their seats, eyes flicking toward Elise as she walked slowly, deliberately down the aisle. She was exactly as she had been before. Same black briefcase. Same quiet confidence. Same seat. 2A. She slid into it smoothly, set her belongings down, and folded her hands neatly in her lap. And then, she turned her head, her eyes meeting Lorraine's. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat, didn't challenge. She simply watched. And that, Lorraine realized with growing discomfort, was worse. Much worse. Because Elise wasn't the one who had something to prove now. She was. Lorraine had drawn the line. And now, the whole plane was waiting to see what she would do next. Lorraine Tanner had spent her entire career believing in certainty. There were rules, policies, a way of doing things that kept the world orderly. That kept her in control. She knew how to spot a problem before it started. How to handle a situation before it escalated. But this was something else. This was unwritten, unspoken. It had not been trained into her. And it was spiraling beyond her grasp. She stood frozen near the galley, gripping the edge of the counter, her pulse hammering in her ears as Elise Gardner settled back into seat 2A. The same seat Lorraine had insisted she leave. There was no confrontation, no declaration of victory. Elise did not gloat. She simply sat. And yet, the air inside the cabin shifted. Passengers watched. They weren't staring openly, but Lorraine could feel them. Their heads turned ever so slightly. Their whispers barely restrained. They had seen who had been asked to leave. And now, they had seen who had come back. It was not just about the seat anymore. It was about the moment. A moment Lorraine had set in motion. And now, she was standing in the wreckage of it. The intercom crackled. The captain's voice hummed through the speakers. Steady. Routine. Flight attendants. Prepare for takeoff. Lorraine's breath hitched. That was it. No more delays. No more distractions. She had expected Elise to fight. To argue. To push back. To demand apologies and explanations. But Elise had done none of that. She had walked off the plane with the quiet dignity of a woman who already knew she would return. And now that she was back, Lorraine felt something she hadn't expected. Not anger. Not annoyance. Fear. Because Elise hadn't fought for the seat. She had simply reclaimed it. And somehow, that was worse. Lorraine straightened her uniform, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles in the fabric. She needed control. Now, she stepped into the aisle. Her voice sharp and clipped. Rehearsed for professionalism. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. We ask that you fasten your seatbelts as we prepare for departure. If you need anything during the flight, please do not hesitate to ask. She didn't glance at Elise. But she knew Elise was watching her. The plane began to taxi. Lorraine moved through the cabin, checking seatbelts, ensuring overhead compartments were locked, finding anything to focus on except the tension curling in her gut. But then, just as she reached row 2, a voice called to her. Low, measured. Excuse me, Miss Tanner. Lorraine stilled. Elise had not spoken to her since returning. Had not needed to. But now, here it was. Lorraine turned, her mask of professionalism locked in place. Yes? Elise tilted her head slightly. Her voice steady, controlled. I wanted to thank you for your assistance earlier. Lorraine felt a cold chill slide down her spine. Passengers within earshot still. A flicker of interest flashed in their eyes. They weren't sure if this was small talk or something more. Lorraine's throat went dry. Of course, she managed. Neutral. Detached. Elise nodded slowly. Then, with unnerving calm, she added, I trust there won't be any further issues? The words weren't loud. They weren't accusatory. But they landed like a hammer. And everyone heard them. A woman in row 3 shifted uncomfortably. A man near the aisle cleared his throat. Because they knew what was happening. This was not a simple customer service exchange. It was a question, a challenge, and a reckoning. Lorraine felt her face flush. Her pulse kicked against her ribs. She had spent the last hour convincing herself that her decision had been professional. That it had been about seating confusion. About protocol. About ensuring that first class remained as it should be. But now, standing before Elise, under the weight of so many eyes, she felt something she could not explain. The creeping awareness of a truth she had refused to name. The realization that this was never about the seat. The realization that it had always been about the woman in it. Lorraine swallowed hard. No, ma'am, she said, forcing the words through her teeth. No further issues. Elise held her gaze for a moment longer. Then, she simply nodded. Good. And with that, she returned to her book. Her hands resting calmly, deliberately over the pages. The conversation was over. And yet, it wasn't. Because Lorraine could feel it. The shift in the air. The weight pressing into her ribs. She had lost something in this moment. Something deeper than control. She had lost certainty. And she did not know how to get it back. The cabin had settled into a rhythmic hum. The steady drone of engines. The hushed murmur of passengers flipping through in-flight magazines. The clinking of glasses as drinks were quietly poured. And yet, for Lorraine Tanner, the silence was deafening. She moved through the aisle with rehearsed efficiency. But the air around her felt heavier now. Denser. Something unspoken had lodged itself in the space between her and Elise Gardner. Between her and the passengers who had witnessed their exchange. They weren't looking at her anymore. Not directly, but she could feel their awareness. It wasn't what they saw that unsettled her. It was what they understood. Elise, for her part, remained entirely composed. She had returned to her book. One leg crossed elegantly over the other. A quiet picture of ease. But nothing about this was easy for Lorraine. She could feel herself spiraling. Because it wasn't just about the seat anymore. It wasn't even about Elise anymore. It was about what this moment had revealed about Lorraine herself. Had she really believed, even for a second, that this woman, a woman who carried herself with the kind of unshakable calm Lorraine had only ever seen in people who understood power, wasn't supposed to be here? Had she really convinced herself that she wasn't part of the problem? She had spent years, decades, following the rules, keeping things in order, making sure things ran as they should. She had told herself that doing things right was what mattered. That fairness was a policy. Not a feeling. But fairness, she was starting to understand, was only fair to those who had written the rules in the first place. And in the span of a single flight, in the span of a single moment, She had become the rule someone else had to endure. The thought made her stomach twist. As she reached the front of the cabin, she caught sight of Rebecca, the senior flight attendant, standing near the galley. Rebecca had been watching, not interfering, just watching. Lorraine hesitated before stepping closer. She needed an anchor, something solid to hold onto before she lost her grip on the situation entirely. Rebecca, she said, keeping her voice low. Rebecca didn't look up from the flight manifest she had been reviewing. Yes? Lorraine swallowed. Did I? She stopped. Adjusted. Recalculated. I mean, do you think I handled that the right way? This time, Rebecca looked up, and her silence was sharp enough to cut. Why do you ask? She said finally. Her voice measured. Lorraine shifted. Uncomfortable. I want to be sure I did my job correctly. Rebecca exhaled, setting the manifest down carefully. Lorraine, she said, and for the first time all flight, there was something in her voice that wasn't neutral. Something close to disappointment. What exactly do you think your job is? The question hit harder than Lorraine expected. She felt her breath catch. To keep things in order, she said, though it came out more like a question than a statement. Rebecca studied her for a long moment. And whose order is that? Lorraine had no answer, because the answer was too heavy to carry. She turned away before Rebecca could say anything else. Before she could see too much. Her body moved on instinct. Adjusting trays, checking passengers, keeping busy, but her mind was elsewhere. Back at seat 2A. Back at the moment she had drawn a line in the sand. Only to realize the tide had already erased it. At some point, she found herself at the beverage cart again, refilling drinks in first class. A man across the aisle from Elise, a well-dressed businessman with polished shoes and an expensive watch, cleared his throat as she approached. I'll take another whiskey, he said. His voice was too casual, the kind of casual that held layers. He wasn't just ordering a drink. He was testing something. Lorraine poured the whiskey without hesitation, handing him the glass. She was about to step away when he gave her a knowing smirk and tipped his head toward Elise. Brave of you, he murmured under his breath. Lorraine frozen. The air shifted. Excuse me, she said, barely above a whisper. He took a slow sip of his drink. Most people wouldn't have done what you did, he said. Lorraine felt her entire body lock up. And what exactly do you think I did? She asked, keeping her voice even. The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. Forget it, he said. Just saying. Not everyone belongs up here. But I guess you already knew that. The words hit like a slap. And for the first time all flight, Lorraine felt something crack inside her. Something deep. Because this was the moment she had been avoiding. The moment where she had to choose. Did she let this stand? Did she let herself become the kind of person who let it slide? Or did she do what she should have done from the start? Elise turned the page in her book. Unfazed. She had heard. Of course, she had heard. But she did not react. She did not need to. Because this wasn't her test. It was Lorraine's. Lorraine's breath came sharp and uneven. She turned, leveling the businessman with a look that cut through the forced politeness between them. She's a first-class passenger, Lorraine said, her voice sharp, steady. Same as you. The businessman blinked. If there's anything else you need, let me know. Lorraine interrupted, clipped, final. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. Because for the first time on all flights, she knew exactly what her job was. And it had never been to decide who belonged. It had always been to make sure everyone did. She moved on before she could think too hard about what had just happened. But when she passed seat 2A, something made her stop. Elise was still reading, still poised, still unshaken. But for the first time, she looked up, and their eyes met. Elise didn't speak. She didn't need to. Because this time, it was Elise who was watching Lorraine. And for the first time all flight, Lorraine realized that the real question wasn't whether Elise belonged in first class. It was whether she did. Lorraine Tanner had spent years perfecting the art of making herself small. Not in stature. No, that wasn't the kind of smallness she had mastered. But in presence. In the way she moved through the world. careful not to disturb the carefully built structures of power that had existed long before she had ever stepped foot in them. She had learned when to speak and when to swallow. She had learned what battles could be fought and which were lost before they began. And she had learned, above all else, that silence was survival. But now, she wasn't sure. Now, she wasn't certain that the silence she had wrapped herself in for so long had ever been protection at all. Because in the silence, things festered. In the silence, people like that businessman in first class said things and meant them. In the silence, the world reshaped itself around the comfortable. And people like Elise Gardner were left to endure it. Not because they couldn't fight, but because they shouldn't have to. She could feel the shift in the cabin. It wasn't overt. No raised voices. No heated arguments. No grand declarations. But there was a tension in the air now. Something restless. Something unnamed. Lorraine knew that passengers had seen the exchange. That some had heard it. She also knew that most of them would pretend they hadn't. Because that was the dance. Wasn't it? The careful, unspoken agreement between those who benefited from the world as it was and those who knew better but feared the cost of saying so. She moved through the rows. Her hands steady but her mind spinning. Had she just made things worse for herself? She had been on enough flights. Had been in enough rooms. To know that moments like these had a way of slipping through the cracks. That there would be no scene. No eruption of outrage. No dramatic confrontation. Instead, there would be small, sharp consequences. A look from a superior. A note on her file. A whispered comment in a break room about her being difficult. The people who said they wanted fairness. Who claimed they believed in treating everyone equally. Never liked being reminded that they did not. Lorraine took a slow breath. Willing herself to let it go. To let this go. And then, excuse me. She turned. It was Elise. For the first time since the flight began. She was looking directly at Lorraine. And this was different. This was not the same glance from earlier. The quiet, knowing assessment. This was something else. Yes? Lorraine asked, forcing her voice into something even. Could I have another glass of water? Elise asked, her voice smooth, calm. Lorraine nodded, her hands moving before her thoughts could catch up. It was nothing. A simple request. Something she had done 1,000 times before. And yet, as she poured the water, she felt a weight settle in the space between them. She turned back, placing the glass on Elise's tray. Waiting. Elise's fingers brushed the stem of the glass. But she didn't lift it. Instead, she looked up. I saw what you did. The words were soft, but they landed heavy. Lorraine's throat went dry. Elise didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Because she wasn't talking about the water. Lorraine exhaled slowly. I was just doing my job. Elise tilted her head slightly. Considering that. Then, she smiled. Not in amusement. Not in dismissal. But in recognition. Sure, she said, her voice carrying just the slightest trace of something that felt like victory. Your job. And just like that, she lifted the glass and took a sip. An action so unremarkable that it was remarkable. Because Lorraine understood exactly what was happening. Elise wasn't thanking her. Elise was acknowledging her. And somehow, that was more powerful than gratitude could ever be. Lorraine walked away before she could overthink it. She didn't need to. She had already decided. Because the thing about silence, the thing no one ever tells you, is that it doesn't actually keep you safe. It keeps other people comfortable. And Lorraine Tanner was tired of mistaking one for the other. There is something about being seen that unsettles people. Not the kind of being seen that they expect. The rehearsed presentations of self. The curated identities that fit neatly into the world as it is. But the kind of being seen that leaves no room for denial. The kind that forces people to ask themselves questions they don't want to answer. Lorraine Tanner had learned that the hard way. She had spent years making herself as palatable as possible. Calm, professional, efficient. And still, it had never been enough. Because the rules had never been about how well she did her job. The rules had always been about who she was while doing it. And the moment she had forgotten that. The moment she had allowed herself to be more than silent compliance. The world had reminded her. The flight was nearing its descent now. The hum of quiet conversations. The rustling of carry-ons being shuffled into place. The clipped instructions from the flight deck. All of it signaled the closing act. Lorraine could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. A slow tightening in her chest. Because now, there were only two options. Either this ended like all the others had, slipping into the comfortable murk of things unspoken, or it didn't. Either she walked away from this flight untouched, or she paid the price. She moved through the aisle, gathering cups, adjusting trays, her hands steady even as the tension in her body mounted. When she reached row 3A, she hesitated. She hadn't meant to. It had been the smallest fraction of a second. A pause so brief it was barely there. But Elise Gardner had noticed. "You okay?" Elise asked, her voice low enough that no one else would hear. Lorraine could have lied. She had lied so many times before. "Of course," she said. But even as she said it, she knew Elise wasn't fooled. Elise was still watching her, still seeing her, and Lorraine had the sudden, terrible realization that she wasn't sure she wanted to be seen. Not like this. Not when she knew what was coming. Elise lifted her glass slightly. A small, deliberate gesture. "You ever get tired of it?" she asked. Lorraine felt her throat tighten. She didn't need to ask what it was. She had known from the moment Elise boarded this plane. Hell, she had known long before that. Every day, Lorraine admitted before she could stop herself. She should have left it at that. She should have taken the glass. Walked away. Let this moment disappear into the endless blur of all the others. But instead, she stayed. Elise tilted her head slightly. "Then why do you keep doing it?" Lorraine let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Why do you?" Elise smiled. But it wasn't amusing. It was understanding. Because that was the thing. Wasn't it? Neither of them had ever been given the luxury of stopping. Lorraine was still thinking about the conversation when she heard the voices. Not loud, not obvious, but pointed. She turned just in time to see him. The businessman from earlier, the one who had scoffed at Elise, the one who had made Lorraine's job harder in ways he would never acknowledge, was leaning over, talking to one of the other passengers. Lorraine didn't catch all of it. She didn't have to. Entitled these days, doesn't matter who you are anymore. I guess. People just expect things, like the world owes them something. The words were casual, spoken in the comfortable confidence of someone who had never been told they were the problem. And Lorraine felt it, the simmering heat of something that had been pressing against the edges of her patience all day. She had spent her whole life letting moments like this pass. She had told herself that they weren't worth it. That people like him weren't worth it. But today, she wasn't sure she could stomach another second of it. So, she turned, and she looked at him. Not with anger, not with hostility, just with certainty. And that was enough. Because certainty unsettled people like him. He saw her seeing him. And for a moment, he faltered. "Something wrong?" she asked. Her voice level. He blinked, opened his mouth, closed it, and just like that, he turned back around. Because that was the difference between them. He could afford to look away. Lorraine could not. The flight landed without further incident. Lorraine watched as the passengers filed out, one after another, back into their lives, back into their comfort. Elise Gardner was the last to leave. She stopped at the threshold, turning just slightly. "You handled that well," she said, and it wasn't a compliment. It was recognition. Lorraine nodded. Elise studied her for a moment longer, as if she wanted to say something else. But then, she didn't. She just gave Lorraine one last look. And then she was gone. The cabin was empty now. The world was quiet again. And Lorraine was still standing. But she knew that this wasn't the end of it. Because it never was. Because there was always a cost. And Lorraine Tanner had just made herself too visible to ignore. They say that when a thing has ended, you know it. That there is a finality. A door closing. A page turning. A weight lifted. But Lorraine Tanner knew better. Because for some people, the ending never really comes. It simply shifts, reconfigures, waits. And sometimes, it comes looking for you when you least expect it. The airport was humming with its usual rhythm. Passengers coming and going, rolling suitcases, Clipped announcements overhead. Everything moving forward as if the world itself were incapable of stopping. Lorraine wanted to believe that she could move forward with it. She had told herself that the moment she stepped off that plane, it was over. That what had happened in first class. The confrontation, the certainty, the quiet unraveling of unspoken truths, was something she could leave right there on the tarmac. But deep down, she knew the world didn't work that way. And when she saw her supervisor waiting near the break room, arms folded, expression unreadable, she knew she had been right. Lorraine. Her name was spoken with the kind of careful restraint that made her stomach tighten. She nodded, stepping forward, her back straight, her face unreadable. You have a minute? It wasn't a question. She followed him down the hall. The cool sterility of the airport pressing in around her. She could feel eyes on her. Co-workers who had already heard something but wouldn't ask. That was how it always was. People didn't ask because they didn't want to know. Because knowing meant acknowledging. And acknowledging meant they might have to do something about it. The office was small, cramped, dimly lit, a room for discussions that people didn't want to have in public. Her supervisor gestured for her to sit. She didn't. There's been a complaint. There it was. Lorraine didn't react. She had expected this. A passenger claims you made them uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. The word sat heavy between them. She had heard it before. She had felt it before. Because, uncomfortable, was not about what she had done. It was about who she was while doing it. I see, she said, her voice steady. Her supervisor exhaled, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. Look, Lorraine, I've seen your record. You've been here a long time. You do good work. She didn't respond. She knew what was coming next. But I need you to understand that perception matters. Even if you didn't mean anything by it. Quote. Lorraine let out a quiet laugh. Not because it was funny. But because she had lived this moment before. 100 different ways. 100 different times. It was never about what she meant. It was always about how someone else chose to interpret her presence. And she had dared to exist in a space where she was not expected to be silent. Do you know who made the complaint? She asked. Already knowing the answer. Her supervisor shifted uncomfortably. It's not important. It's important to me. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Look, Lorraine, I just need you to be more careful. We don't want any problems. We don't want any problems. She had heard those words before. Too. What they meant was, we don't want the kind of problems that force us to confront anything real. What they meant was, we don't want to have to defend you. Because doing so would mean admitting that there was something that needed defending. She could have fought it. She could have demanded specifics. She could have asked why she needed to be careful when the person who had caused the problem, the one who had whispered his quiet grievances, the one who had been unsettled by her mere existence, was free to walk away unbothered. But Lorraine Tanner knew better. She knew that the fight wasn't here. Not in this office. Not in the clipped words of a man who would rather smooth things over than ask himself why this had happened in the first place. So she nodded. And she turned. And she walked out of that office without another word. The airport felt different now. Colder. Like something had shifted. But no one else had noticed. Like a truth had been spoken and then buried in the same breath. She thought about Elise Gardner. About the quiet understanding in her eyes. About the way she had asked, you ever get tired of it? And the answer, Lorraine realized, was yes. She was so goddamn tired. But she wasn't done. Because being tired and being done were not the same thing. And people like Lorraine Tanner didn't get the luxury of being done. Not yet. Not now. Not ever. She walked to the window. Staring out at the tarmac. Planes coming in. Planes going out. People moving. Always moving. She placed a hand on the glass. Feeling the cool surface beneath her fingertips. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself a moment of quiet rage. Not the kind that burned fast and reckless. Not the kind that demanded to be seen. But the kind that settled deep inside her. Waiting. Because some things should not be forgotten. And Lorraine Tanner had just made herself a witness. And that, she knew, was something they would never be able to silence.